Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Tony Hynes. Looking forward to our conversation today, Tony.
Thank you so much for having me, Simon.
Yeah. So it's ages, isn't it? It's got to be 2 years since we did the last one. Maybe just under, maybe just over. I should have checked, shouldn't I? If I was as detail-oriented as I should be, perhaps I should have checked. So there's a link, listeners. There's a fantastic interview with Tony last time, and so there's a link to that into the show notes. But today we're going to talk about healing. So, what does healing mean to you, Tony?
Healing for me means really processing in healthy ways the trauma that you have experienced throughout your life course. And as it relates to adoption, I don't necessarily always feel that healing even is the right terminology to use for us as adoptees, because a lot of us are adoptees are experiencing things that we're told to heal from that someone who is not adopted would not be told to heal from. For example, if I lost or someone who is not adopted loses their parent, loses their mom, loses their dad to cancer, 5 years later after that death, that person is not then asked, hey, have you healed from the death of your parent, the death of your mom, the death of your dad? But as adoptees, often we are asked, have we healed from the trauma that we have experienced from being separated from our birth families, being separated from our nations of origin, being separated from our languages? So there are certain things in life that really do come with a sense and a feeling of healing. But with adoption, there's this increased kind of complexity involved with the word, with what it means, with how we're kind of coming to it and thinking about it.
Yeah. Wow. I love that different, I love that different take on it, right? So the whole point of the podcast is to bring different opinions to this subject. And I value them. The newer and more different is, I think, sometimes the better for us. So this grief thing. So a adoptee called Pamela Karanova came on a few months ago, and she was talking about one of the big things that helped her on her healing is looking at it like it's grief. So I think that the ideas that you're putting forward here, that we wouldn't be telling anybody to get over their grief, would we? Or heal from the grief. We just wouldn't use that. We wouldn't ask them that question, and we wouldn't use that word. So, what for you is a you use the word processing. Is that the best word? Is that the best word, or have you got other kind of words that you think we could explore?
I think processing is a good word. I always think that there's room for improvement and growth around language. And so I use processing, other people use different terminology. Why I like the word processing is something that's ongoing, something that's continuous, something that isn't finished. And what else is something that is ongoing, isn't finished? Adoption and how we're feeling about it. Adoption, we talk about it as this lifelong journey. So processing goes kind of hand in hand and synonymous then with this lifelong journey of adoption, how we're considering it, how we're thinking about it, how we feel in our bodies about it as adoptees. And so that's why I like the term processing. But I do think that processing should go hand in hand with processing in healthy ways, because we can process things in ways that aren't healthy for us, though. I could be processing a loss and I could be lashing out at the world. I could be really just angry at people, and that could come out in my work environment or my home environment, or I could really be dissociating and pull back from society and be a recluse. And all of those things still involve me reprocessing the loss, involved with my story, my history. But is that processing in a healthy way? No. Processing in a healthy way would be reaching out to people in my community who I feel comfortable venting with, sharing with. Processing might mean finding a therapist who is well versed in adoption related trauma issues. Processing in a healthy way might mean taking a long walk or doing taking deep breaths. And so I think focusing on the processing is really important, and then focusing on, what is healthy processing for you, because it's going to be different for different people. It's not uniform. But that's why I like that terminology. It allows for that kind of ongoing conversation with oneself and with their community too.
Yeah. So are you talking about processing the feelings? I mean, like, so trauma seems to me to live on as feelings, and you obviously mentioned the stuff in the body, so it's the body work. It's not just the feelings, it's the sensations as well. So it's what we sense in our body along with what would be called I guess we would normally associate with our heart, wouldn't we? We'd be thinking about healing in the feelings in our heart and the sensations in our body. Is that what you mean? Am I on the right lines?
Yes, you are. And so we are thinking about our feelings in our body when it comes to that processing work. And we also know that there's scientific reasons why it's important to do that processing around our feelings, because our feelings also relate to how our bodies react to those feelings, to those traumas. So our bodies are reacting in cognitive ways, meaning the way that we even communicate, the way that we sleep, the way that we eat is impacted by the feelings that we have surrounding our stories, surrounding trauma. And so processing in healthy ways allows us to also sometimes to eat better, to sleep better, to communicate with others in our lives better. And when it comes to, what are we processing specifically, as adoptees, usually what we're processing, especially as adults, also as children too, is that first separation from birth family. I was having a discussion with a clinician yesterday, and she was saying, I'm working, Tony, with an adopted family right now. The adopted family, they're saying to me that, well, we adopted our child when they were newborn. And when they were a newborn and we adopted our child, 30 minutes after they were born, they were separated from their birth mom. And so we thought that there wouldn't be trauma and loss associated with that. And so having a conversation with them about, well, that child spent the first, 9 months, that gestational period, with their birth mom, hearing their birth mom's voice, getting, nutrients from their birth mom during that first 9 months. And then even after birth, was also hearing the voice of their birth mom. That was the only voice really that they had been hearing when they were in birth mom's belly. And then the first voice that they were hearing in that particular circumstance when they came out of the womb, when they were born. And now we're being separated from that voice. We're being separated from that smell. We're being separated from that face. And so even though your child 8, 9, 10 years later doesn't necessarily have this visual memory, obviously, of their birth, their body still remembers those feelings that they had. Their body still remembers what that separation felt like for them. And so we know scientifically that that's something that's harmful for children, and it's difficult. And so even that alone would require processing. And after that, of course, Simon, that's not the only loss that child is having. The child then has that continued loss, in this case, in a lot of cases, from being able to talk with their birth family growing up, has a loss of the kind of information that other people just kind of have in privileged ways, having baby pictures, knowing the names of birth family members, knowing their family history, knowing their medical information. So all of these other things then tie into that sense of loss then that I'm holding with me, whilst I'm being told a lot of times by society that I should feel, grateful for being adopted, that I should feel grateful for being in a different and quote unquote better situation as an adoptee, which we know to be just different and not better. And in some cases, the opposite, not better. In some cases, worse. And it would either way different. And so all of these things are things that require us to really dig in and ask, questions to adoptees about, hey, how are you feeling about your experience? To give them permission there, to give them permission to share first is important because I think, and I'm not completely opposed to the word healing, but I think with adoptees, sometimes what happens is, especially when coming from non-adoptees, the question of have you healed comes before how are you feeling about, which is also something that is not conducive to helping us process all of what we've experienced in those healthy ways that I mentioned.
So what's the difference between processing the feeling stuff, the feelings, and processing the sensations in our body? What, because they seem to be two different things. To me, clearly they're connected. But what does processing mean for each different bit? I haven't got an answer myself clearly to this,
That's a great question. I think when you think about processing sensations, it's involving how we feel a lot of times from a physical standpoint, from a visceral standpoint. So if I'm awake at night and my body is jittery, my body is wondering what to do with itself, that's a sensation that I'm feeling. So that would involve taking a deep breath and realizing that my body is feeling that, realizing that when my body is at high alert, and then realizing, okay, what's happening in my body is at high alert. Again, I mentioned the hand shaking. Are my eyes kind of wide open? Am I jittery in other parts of my body? Am I breathing really heavily? So all of that sensations, involves kind of thinking about what my body is doing in the moment, and can even involve some feelings. They're tied into one another because it can also involve maybe my body, maybe it feels angry right now. Maybe I'm clenching my fist and I don't know why. That's a sensation. It's coming. Sensation is coming over you kind of in that moment. It's kind of in that moment. How am I feeling right now? And that's the sensation that's going on. Whereas with feelings, feelings are also things that can be sensations that we're thinking about in the moment, but feelings involve more of a, how am I feeling kind of in a more general standpoint, and not just right now, but how have I been feeling over the course of today? How is not only my body been feeling, but how's my mind feeling about my day? Am I sad? Am I happy? Am I worried? Am I nervous? The body can kind of tell us that we're nervous, but is that what I'm feeling? Am I feeling kind of nervous in my head? Do I think that I'm nervous because my body is doing these things? And then from a kind of month to month or year to year standpoint, how have I been feeling over the course of the past couple months about this, about my friend moving away, for example, about my parent and I not having a good relationship? How am I feeling about being an adoptee? Those are feelings that we have that aren't just, those sensations. I think it's important to recognize both of those, how sensations, how are our bodies feeling in the kind of right away, if you will, standpoint of things. And then also from that macro standpoint of how am I feeling on a day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year basis about my situation? If we can, in our bodies and in our heads and in our minds, understand both of those things better about ourselves, it leads to that healthy processing work.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking about. So I've had now 2 face-to-face sessions with a somatic experiencer woman, and so during the hour session with her, we do some body work and we do some discussion as well. So she's jumping between the 2 bits. So we've got the pure what's going on what's going on for you, Simon. So what she did, whilst we were doing the kind of she was just guiding me through the sensations. And as she did that, I started crying. Right, so some tears came out for me. So and she was asking me. She was keeping it, asking some little, a few questions, not too much, and I actually or making comments on what might be going on, and I intentionally did not answer anything back. I just stayed in the feeling space, and then after we'd done that for a while, then we went into the then we went, I opened my eyes and we went into a conversation about what had been happening. So we were kind of like, it's almost as if we started. People talk about this. I don't know. Have you heard this? It's about talking. Starting bottom up. So most therapy is top down. So it's brain first, right? Whereas somatic stuff is they call it bottom up. So it looks at what's going on in the body as the kind of the point, the entry point, and then you look at the feelings. So that in a kind of like that's like a microcosm really of what came to mind as you were talking. And so we can look at this in a micro way, like what's happening for Simon what's happening for us at night, as you're saying, and we know about sort of anxiety and insomnia and how that plays out. Look at it from the micro perspective of what's happening for us in the moment, what was happening for me in the moment of that session. And then we can look at the kind of the macro side of it, which is perhaps our learning around this stuff. So if we're reading the Bessel van der Kolk book about Body Keeps the Score, or we're reading Peter Levine book about somatic stuff, and that's kind of the macro side. We're listening to a podcast to inform ourselves about the difference between these things. That's what comes to mind for me. The processing of in that macro moment is releasing the grief that's inside, hence the tears. Processing of the grief, and then the processing of the feelings that go. Processing the physical and then processing the emotion.
Yeah, I think doing both of those things are really important. Processing, as you said, the physical and the emotion allow us to release a lot of some of these, I don't want to say negative feelings, but I do want to say feelings that have been weighing us down, feelings that have been making it really hard for us to think about other things for a long time. And it doesn't mean that those feelings and those thoughts will never come back, but sometimes it is helpful in ways that mitigate or lessen the negative feelings that we have and negative sensations that we have associated with those memories.
Yeah. What's important to you around this judging of feelings, Tony?
Around repeat that. Around this,
what's important to you around this, the judging, talking about judging, you talking about negative feelings. What's your feeling, right, around this judgment of our feelings and calling them negative or positive? What have you got on that?
as adoptees, I would say, yeah, as adoptees, I think that it's a judgment and it's kind of a dismissal of feeling negatively there's a dismissal that goes on with, well, if I, Tony, feel negatively about my experience as an adoptee, any piece of it, then there's a, well, sometimes there's a why do you feel that way? But there's also a, well, yeah, I get that you feel that way, but aren't you glad that you have this over this? Even though that part is bad, isn't that part kind of worth it because you were able to get this? And again, I feel like because there isn't a proper understanding of the loss, of the grief, of the pain involved with adoption process, the results in the first place, there isn't an understanding of how problematic statements like that are in the first place. The same kind of analogy I used earlier. If my father died, if my mother died, and I inherited $1 million. Let's say I inherited $1 million. My father died at the age of 45. Let's say I'm 22. My father's 45. He dies of a heart attack. And let's say he was well off. This is just a
Yeah.
scenario I'm just creating. And I inherit $1 million. Some people might think in their heads, but they would never say out loud, hey, it's bad that your father died, but aren't you glad though? At least you got $1 million out of it, right? Like that's no one would ever say that. And there would be an understanding, even if you had that $1 million, that yes, this part of my life financially might be the financial side of my life might be easier, right? I might be more comfortable financially, but that doesn't negate the pain that I feel from my father's death. And so even though I have this, that doesn't mean that I can't still feel negatively about my father dying, even though I'm in a quote, better community, which is, it really means there's the only metric people are usually using for that when they talk about adoption is you're in a richer, wealthier area where the schools are better, where there's less crime. There isn't an understanding of, well, I'm an interracial adoptee, Simon. So if I'm growing up in a predominantly white community that's not diverse, that isn't necessarily a safer environment for me from maybe from the crime standpoint, maybe it is, but it isn't a safer environment for me. It's been proven from a racial identity standpoint, from not experiencing racism in my community standpoint, from my birth family being honored, from my culture being honored. So it's not a safe environment for me a lot of times and most times for adoptees growing up in that specific environment. But it's codified as this, well, aren't you glad you're in this better community? And even if I give people that argument to say, well, yeah, I guess I am in a community maybe that would have had less crime than the community that I would have grown up in with my birth family. But that doesn't mean that I'm not sad that I'm not able to live with my sister, that we're not able to see each other's face every day, that I somehow would have still chosen this if I had the option. If you gave me the opportunity, I would say, I don't know. Like this is just my life. I can't choose one or the other because this is how I feel. And some adoptees will answer that question differently. Some adoptees will say, well, I would have chosen to grow up with my birth family, or I still would have chosen to be with my adoptive family. It's for me, it's I was given a decision when I was 4 or 5 years old to make. But if I was given that same decision at 16, 17 years old, I can't tell you what it would be because I only know the life that I'm living. And the life that I'm living has this adoptive family who weren't perfect, but did a lot of things in the quote the right way, but also has a birth family who I didn't get to experience, live with, see, know information about. And that part is painful. So when it comes to the judgment of feelings around adoption are often incomplete because the judgments are incomplete, and therefore a lot of times adoptees feel incomplete in our kind of processing of our feelings because we haven't been given permission to quote complete how we're feeling about our feelings because we get shut down a lot of times and told that we should feel grateful or glad, and that kind of for a lot of adoptees out there kind of shuts down those thoughts.
It does, yeah, it does. And I'm glad you took it in that way. I'm glad you took it down that route because it wasn't. There's some genius and wisdom in what you just shared, Tony. What about our feelings about our feelings and our internal judgment about our own feelings rather than society's judgment of our feelings? And this question that you ask, like, are you whole? Have you healed yet? It's just like a really rude question, isn't it? It's like a insecure and not no. What's the word? It's just stupid. It's just I don't often swear on the podcast, but it's a stupid effing question, really, isn't it? But this to come from somebody outside. But what about internal and our own judgments of our own feelings?
Yeah, no, that's another great point, Simon. And I think the first thing that comes to mind is our own feelings about our feelings, not society's feelings, and how hard it is to divorce those two things. Because a
Ah,
lot of times our own feelings about our feelings are coded by social desirability and how we think that we should feel about our feelings based upon how society feels about our situations. I was at a gala this past weekend, and there was a Star of Adoption award that my organization, Center for Adoption Support and Education, was putting on, where we honor an adoptee who is just doing good things. And there was an adoptee, a younger adoptee who was 15 years old, and she was speaking about her experience, and she was speaking just about the love that she had for her family. And then I remember the end of this speech, she invited her family on stage with her. She's an interracial adoptee, and I think she has at least seven siblings, and all of them are white, and she's black. And they took this kind of family photo, family portrait in the middle, and it was very beautiful and great. Also, though, as an interracial adoptee who's double her age, I also wondered to myself, will she feel exactly the same in 10 years about describing how she feels as she does right now when she's 15 years old? Because what I've witnessed when I've watched 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 19-year-olds who are adoptees, are old enough to think critically about their experience and to talk about it. So they've talked about their experience. And normally, kids in these particular age groups, especially in public facing forums, don't criticize not only their adopted family, they don't criticize adoption at all. They talk about, how maybe they were feeling sad, but now they're feeling better. And they talk about how great their families are. It's not all, obviously, this is just a trend from what I've witnessed. And then when you get into what I've witnessed from the mid 20s adoptees out there, is saying things like, when I was younger, I was doing things like that, or now I'm estranged from my adopted family, or now I'm talking more critically about my adopted family. Now I'm feeling differently about my adopted family. And I asked them, well, why? Why do you feel differently? And they say, well, I've been able to live independently from them now, or I was feeling this way for a long time and I didn't feel like I had permission, or I didn't know how I was feeling, or I felt like that's what people expected from me. And so it's very hard as an adoptee sometimes to recognize, okay, is what I'm feeling separate from what others are kind of telling me I should feel, or is it just how I feel? And I think that that's those are legitimate conversations within kind of their own heads to have, because it will lead them to eventually figure it out and to say, okay, no, this is how I'm really feeling about this. I really am really proud of my adoptive family and what we have been able to uh, come to in terms of connectedness, sense of connectedness with each other. Or no, I actually don't feel good about my adoption. I don't feel good about the way that I was brought to the United States. Or I feel good and bad about different things related to my adoptive experience. And those are feelings that we have, I think, after exploring. And I had to do this for myself too, because when I wrote my book, Simon, I wrote The Son with Two Moms, which is a memoir I wrote about my life as a Black adoptee growing up with two white moms. And I wrote it. I remember one of the first book talks that I gave, there was a family friend of ours, and everybody at the end was coming up congratulating me about, how good my speech was, how well I spoke, everything that I said. And family friend comes up to me though, and he says, Tony, um, yeah, that was a really good speech, interesting, but how come you didn't really mention the fights, the verbal arguments that you and your mom had when you were a teenager? Because we, in our church community, we heard about, some of those verbal arguments that you and your mom had going back and forth at one another. And one of the first things I thought in my head was, well, I didn't, I didn't like avoid that. I didn't avoid talking about that. I just didn't get to it. What do you mean? And then though I remembered my mom was in the audience during that book talk. She was sitting front row. And so would I have responded, would I have said the exact same things if my mom wasn't sitting front row there? And I did notice though, and going back, because that speech was recorded and listening to myself, that I was like, you know what? Yeah, I did make some reference to it, but earlier on in my speaking career, I was much more reticent to heap any, criticism on my adoptive moms and how they treated birth family or other things. And I think it was because I was affected by this expectation that I criticize maybe adoption, but stay away from criticizing of family, adopted family. And I realized that to do the work in ways that I want to do it, and to have families understand what they need to do and have adoptees feel empowered, it's really important to speak the truth in all of its forms related to my adoptive experience, which involves criticism of different people, family members, and so I think that when I realized that for myself, I was also able to see my own experiences in a more holistic light, and in a light that actually helped me process in healthier ways and feel better about myself and about how I was feeling about my mom as well too. I can still love her and criticize her. I can do both. We can do both of these things.
Yeah. Incredible stuff there. There's so much, I don't know where to start. I guess first thing is that recognizing that our emotions change over time is clearly a biggie here. So I was talking to I interviewed an adoptee yesterday, the one that I interviewed yesterday for the podcast I released today with Sarah Hibbett. And she said that she didn't actually come fully out of the fog until she was in labour with her first son, and I think that was like when she was 30 or something like that. So some of those kids, the kids in the kids in the teenage years, some of them may be still they're still in the fog to a certain extent, or and that's what happens. Where our feelings change obviously when we come out of the fog. The other thing was like who would criticize their own parents? Like a biological kid, if the parents are in the audience. So I think that's probably another. To me, it feels like a human thing. Is it exacerbated? Is exacerbated? Is that made more prominent or more worse? Lack of honesty. If we're adopted, maybe. I guess it's got to be person to person. And the other thing that pops into my head is, if we're looking at our own judgment of our own feelings, from a like personal, just my stuff on this was that I've been angry about being angry. I've worried about being. I've worried about worrying. And there's that great book by Dick Schwartz, the internal family systems guy, which is another sort of therapy. And his book's called No Bad Parts. And it's about doing the exact opposite to what I've done, right? So it's being grace. It's having grace for ourselves, which I take to mean, in more perhaps straightforward language, not beating myself up about feeling shit sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's hard to do. It's hard sometimes not to beat ourselves up, and especially for that adoptee who's coming out of the quote fog. And I've heard different kind of opinions even on that language recently. I have a friend who wrote a piece about how he doesn't like the term, coming out of the fog for different reasons. His name is AJ Bryan, and you can check that piece out on Medium. And so I know that there are people who feel differently about that terminology, but either way, there is a sense that as adoptees that we're coming into more understanding about how we come to understanding our identity as adoptees kind of later than we would like to sometimes, and how it takes kind of the birth of a child, a marriage, another life happening circumstance, a milestone, if you will, or just a random day in July for us to kind of have this kind of enlightenment over what certain things mean to us. And I think we beat ourselves up so much because we think that we should have figured this stuff out sooner. And that, as you mentioned there, Simon, part of that is a human thing, because as humans, we do feel like, if I had just known what I knew when I was,
yeah,
at 22, if I had known what I know now, I would have taken over the world. I would have done this. I would have gone on this date. I just would have been so much better than I am now. And so I do think that that's a part of the human experience. And I think as adoptees, there's this added pressure because it's, well, there's an you should have figured this adoptee stuff out when you were ages 0 to, let's say, 21. And I think part of that has to do with how we talk about adoption. Usually, if you look at a news story about adoption, there's a story, or foster care, there's a story of a foster family who adopted children, who adopted a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, and they frame adoption as successful. And there are still kids that are in these photos. We still don't really talk about adult adoptees that often. And when we tell the quote story of a successful adoption, it's usually the story of an adoption before the child has turned, 21 years old. And so what does that do? Well, for a lot of adoptees out there, it's, well, I'm 39 years old and I don't feel like a quote successful adoptee. I'm still dealing with this stuff. And there's this pressure there as well because society's been telling us that we should have become successful if we had these certain things by this age, or even if we didn't have these things, now we're adults now. And we just need to deal with it because that's what adults do generally. We just deal with stuff. And so there's that adult pressure of adults. We don't talk about, still adults really needing to process our own stuff. And then that adoption related narrative either. So I tell adoptees that are 50, 60, 70 years old that, hey, there's not an age at which you should have all of this stuff figured out, or any of this stuff figured out. There's a reason why we say adoption is a lifelong journey, because you're always on a journey of self-discovery as an individual and as an adoptee. And so there's nothing wrong with processing all the things that you've experienced in ways that make you feel different, ways that make you feel bad, happy, sad. And the other big piece that goes along with that adoption as a lifelong journey is we're constantly learning new things about ourselves as we get older. So because we don't have a lot of information, a lot of times we're learning new pieces of information about ourselves when we're 42 years old, when we're 52 years old. I just spoke to an adult adoptee who reunited with her birth mom at the age of 55 after getting a piece of information she didn't have for the first 54 years of her life. We have medical situations come up for us that we were unaware of that trigger our thoughts about adoption and our birth families. and different things culturally too that may pop up. So all of those things make it very difficult for us to then say, "Oh, well, I should just have this stuff figured out," because new stuff is also popping up in relation to kind of in also addition to that self-discovery piece that we're doing at the same time.
Yeah. And as you were talking, I was thinking that the trickiest thing about this, or I don't know if it's the trickiest, one of the most tricky things about this is this pre-verbal trauma. So we can't, we haven't got, what do people say? We haven't got a pre-trauma personality to refer to. So we're, as well as the lack of information that you're talking about, there's the lack of, from the outside, the historical information, the factual information, that sort of stuff. We've also got, we haven't got that pre-trauma personality that we can realign with. You know, just it wasn't there for so many of us adopted from birth or in those early periods. And the other thing is that the way that we are with trauma, where we are now in terms of trauma knowledge, we know that. So everybody's been going down the talk therapy route, and it doesn't it doesn't work if you haven't got words for it. If you haven't got a memory, you haven't got a memory of it. You haven't got a cognitive memory of the trauma. So like it's even and yet society has been saying trauma, you know, talk therapy is the way to go. So they've been sending us down the wrong route, and because they didn't know any better, and then judging us against when that wrong route hasn't worked out. So it's like a double whammy of unfairness on us, right?
Oh, for sure. Oh, for sure. You know, it's a double whammy there because they haven't been able to kind of talk about their trauma before, and they haven't been given the language for what it is in the first place there.
Yeah, yeah. So that, to me, that feels like a good place to bring it in, Tony. But what else would you like to? Is there anything else that I've not asked you about? We've talked about this importance of the different language processing versus healing. We've talked about the our own feelings going along with society's feelings, thoughts and feelings, and the point at which there is a divergence between the two. That's maybe that is, you know, just using the coming out of the fog as a shorthand kind of thing. One of the things that we've been talking about recently on the podcast is the fact that this out of the fog moment, it isn't one moment. It's a series. It's a series of moments, and so we are unconscious of something, then we become conscious of it. That's coming out of the fog about that thing, and then we've got the problem, we've got the challenge, we've got the knowledge. We brought it out of the darkness into light, where we can kind of have a look at it. And that's what we'll be doing for the rest of our lives. Will be this ongoing journey that you're talking about, is a series of becoming aware of stuff that we weren't aware of before. So it's not once and done. And maybe that's why the out of the fog, you know, the shorthand that we're using isn't great, because it implies once and done, doesn't it? It's not like, you know, you were using words like ongoing and continuous,
Right.
When you were talking about processing at the start of the conversation.
Right. Out of the fog means clear skies after that. Right? So, if you're flying and you're in an airplane and you're in fog and you're leaving the fog, it means you have clear skies now ahead of you. And so that isn't the reality for a lot of people that would
Yeah,
describe themselves as, out of the fog. They wouldn't describe their lives as lives of clear skies,
yeah,
so to speak.
yeah. It's funny because I don't. I was exploring this a while ago, and so the question that came to me was, what do we see after we've come out of the fog? And it wasn't clear skies. Actually, that's not what coming out of the fog for me means is uh, the fog lifts and we see the dark clouds of trauma, right? The storm clouds, right? And we see we become aware of our trauma, and that's the start of processing it.
Yeah.
And to use your analogy, that's an ongoing journey, whereby maybe um, the trauma clouds thin and then regather, thin and regather, thin and regather, and uh, and I would agree with that. And I'd also say that we are not our trauma, so we aren't the clouds. I'm less interested in exploring the clouds than I am in exploring the space, the sky, the space in which our trauma sits, like who I am, rather than the trauma I feel. I don't know. Does that make any?
Yeah, no, it's beautifully said. It's beautifully said, Simon. And I think that that's a really great way to view how you feel about coming out of the fog, that it doesn't mean that problems don't exist anymore, that it actually allows you to more clearly see what problems have existed so you can begin to tackle them in ways that are healthy moving forward. And I think sometimes with the fog analogy, as adoptees and as kind of this adoptive community, this is what my friend was talking about in his piece that he wrote, was it kind of categorizes to him and to others, and to me as well in some respects, as enlightened adoptees versus non-enlightened adoptees. And so you can be an adoptee who's this kind of progressive adoptee who knows all this stuff about adoption, who understands it, or you can be that adoptee over there who's in the fog, and that it isn't really that cut and dry, that there are plenty of complexities to go along with how we as adoptees examine our own experiences. And so even those of us that might have previously or do describe ourselves as out of the fog, it doesn't mean that we're not still grappling with adoption related trauma or issues, or that we understand everything about our experience or about adoption. And that there aren't things that people who would be described as being, quote, in this fog, that they don't understand in really complex ways about their own experience. They do understand a lot of things about their experiences. And I think it's important to bring all adoptees kind of along, whatever language or terminology. We did focus on language a lot in this particular podcast, but I think that the language piece is really important, but the processing the feelings, the kind of internal work that people are doing on themselves is the most important thing to take away here. Is to continue asking yourself questions about, how do I feel about my experience, whether I'm adopted by birth or later on, or fostered or not. And for those of us that aren't adoptees out there listening, how do you feel about things that have happened in your life? How have they made you feel? How do you think they've impacted your decisions? How do you think they've impacted how you raise maybe your kids? How does it impact how you think about maybe even adoption to begin with? And so I think that those things are really important sticking points here, in addition to the language, in
Yeah,
addition to understanding the societal impacts here.
yeah, for sure. Um, Words are all we've got, right? It's like I was talking about, my experience with this healer, somatic experience. I can't remember what she calls herself. Um, and but and it's I'm 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 feeling some benefits of it. And yet, when I listened to an audiobook by Peter Levine, who is the founder of this somatic stuff, it didn't work for me. And it didn't. And listening to the book didn't work for me because the language, like how can you put words to something that's somatic? It's a big challenge, right? And yet what we've got with a podcast, all we've got is words. So the all we've got is the words. And so what you're saying about asking ourselves, doing our own reflection, asking ourselves our own questions, feeling our own stuff, feeling our way through it, because we're feeling beings that think, aren't we? We're not thinking. We're not thinking beings that feel. We're feeling. It's all about the feeling. But how much feeling can you put in? We try and put as much feeling into the podcast that we're doing, right? But at the end of the day, it's a podcast, so it's words. It's the proof is in the pudding, not the eating. Whatever ours to say, reading the menu isn't the same as eating the pudding.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, Simon, and I don't mean to minimize language because language is extremely important, and that's why I focus so much on language myself. I do think at the same time that sometimes the language that we use, the focus on, well, is this good or bad language can also get us into
Yeah,
positions sometimes within our own adoptee community. Not so much for the outside community, because we do want people to be, not problematic when it comes to language that we're using to describe adoption. You don't want to say put up, you want to say placed, etc. You don't want to say real parent, you want to say first parent or birth parent. So we know that language that from our outside coming into our community is really important. But I think sometimes within our own adoptive community, that language in some ways amongst adoptees divides because we focus on the language and labeling based upon the language rather than in addition to the language, focusing on why we're using it, what's happening, but
yeah,
I don't want to say behind, but in tandem, why we started using that language in the first place. And so the reason that the fog, why that came up when this out of the fog terminology came up is because, yes, it is really important for adoptees to come to kind of this shared perspective about the feeling that they have not just experienced their lives, but that they've kind of dived deeply into how they feel about it. But we want to try to do that without castigating, one faction as more enlightened and the other faction as less enlightened. So sometimes the language that we've come up with has seen us doing that when we were really just trying to make sure that all of us could feel
yeah,
not good about our adoptions, but better about how we process all the feelings surrounding that. And that's why we focus so much on those feelings that you talk about, because it also helps us come up with better language, right? Because then we're saying, okay, this is how I feel when this particular language was used. All right, maybe there's a term, maybe there's a phrase, maybe there's a word that's actually better to describe that.
yeah,
So I use the term interracial adoptee, interracial adoption, and there have been people that agree with me, and I've talked previously about why I prefer that over transracial. I've heard people say, well, I don't think that's a perfect terminology to use either. Okay, well, in the future, that will lead us to hopefully coming up with better terminology for this based upon how people are feeling about the language. So I agree the language comes kind of first and foremost and in tandem with how we feel about its usage.
yeah. And the your friend that had written the piece, it's AJ. What's the surname?
His name is AJ Bryant, and he's an adoptee himself. He's an interracial, intercountry adoptee, and he wrote a piece on Medium. And I'm forgetting the exact title, but if you search his name on Medium, it'll come up. And he wrote a piece about the fog and feelings around categorization around the being in the fog or not being in the fog. So it's really interesting read there. And other adoptees have different opinions about these thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I'll link to that in the show notes, listeners. So that's great. I love the different perspectives that you brought to the table here, Tony. Really, really great, and exploring the different perspectives. I think that's where we move forward. Yeah. Cool. Thank you very much, listeners. Thank you, Tony. We'll speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.